trust is one-to-one, whereas psychological safety is this shared belief within the team. And it's not about being nice. Often psychological safety is, we've got to accept people and we've got to be nice to them. Actually, psychological safety can be really uncomfortable, because actually what I want you to do is challenge me. I want you to speak up, and organizations talk about, we want to speak up culture. That is, yes, we have to give people the voices, but it's this bit that we want them to tell us when things are wrong and they're not right, and we question and challenge. And here, I've got an idea here about this dive. The last time I went here, the current picked up. That means we're not going to get into the wreck on this side. We have to go there. That's great. As opposed to, you might have somebody who's very closed-minded. Yeah, I've been here before. Don't worry about it. We can do it. And you sit there going, okay. And so what happens is, as soon as you shut somebody down, they withhold future conversations too. Because you sit there and go, you know what? I don't care. And we end up with a sort of, the malicious side of us comes out, and you go, you know what? Let's see what happens. Let's see you land flat on your face.
Right.
Now you're in the wrong. So I'm going to prove you by proxy that I was right.
That's Gareth Lock, and this is the All Things Risk podcast. Welcome and welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. I'm Ben Catania. I'm your host. This is my show. This is the show where we use the lenses of risk and uncertainty to understand ourselves and our world a little bit better. Today, we look at risk and decision-making in the world of deep sea diving. And this provides us with so many transferable lessons to other contexts. And it is also a very fun conversation. My guest for this episode is Gareth Lock. Gareth is the founder of The Human Diver, an organization that improves the effectiveness of diving skills through specific human factors training, and you will hear more about what that is exactly. Gareth has had a very long career as a diver. He started out diving in his time at the Royal Air Force, where he spent 25 years. And over the years, he realized that one thing the military does very well is teamwork. And that's, of course, because poor decisions, bad behavior, or a lack of situational awareness can cost lives. Gareth found that the world of diving focused heavily on technical expertise, obviously important, but emphasized human behaviors and decision-making far less than it should. As a result, he brings these human factors approaches to diving. Gareth has led many complex dives all over the world, including for the deepwater oil and gas sector. He has also taken a huge amount of amazing underwater photos, which you can see on his website. This conversation is filled with wonderful insights about working as a team, decision-making. Gareth talks about planning, the importance of constructive dissent, making change happen, systems thinking, and much more. Let's get into it. Here is Gareth Lock. Gareth, welcome to the All Things Risk podcast. This is awesome. Thank you for being here and for dialing in all the way from Sao Paulo. So welcome.
Thanks so much, Ben, for the invite. Really, really looking forward to this.
So look, before we get into some of these really very interesting topics about human factors and diving and all that stuff, I'd love for you to just give a little bit of background as to who you are and kind of how you got into this world, because you had this long career in the RAF, and maybe if you just go back a little bit and explain how you got into all this.
Yeah. So 1989, joined the Royal Air Force, courtesy of Top Gun in 88. And so that was my motivation. And there I had a fairly long sort of different career. It spanned a lot of things. So it wasn't just flying. So I had 10 years on a frontline squadron flying on Hercules transport aircraft, and then became a flight instructor within that role. And then I left the front line, took a master's degree in aerospace systems. So it was a crash course in anything to do with aviation systems engineering, so propulsion, guidance, weapon systems. Then moved into flight trials and then research and development work with our research arm within the Ministry of Defense, DSTL. And then the last sort of 4.5, 5 years was a requirements manager and systems engineer putting defensive aid systems onto helicopters and large transport aircraft. So operating in threat areas and preventing them getting shot down. I then decided to leave, left in February 2015, and wanted to bring my sort of knowledge of crew resource management, human factors, into the diving space. Or in fact, it started off in diving and oil and gas and healthcare and other areas. And the challenge there was that trying to get a foot into the door is pretty difficult in a lot of industries when you're not known. But my passion was about trying to improve safety in the sports diving space. So in my while I was doing my master's degree, I was in the States and I had a near miss on a dive. I had equipment failure, managed to resolve it, came back to the UK and said, right, how do I report this? How do I share this learning? And there wasn't really an obvious place to do it. So that was in 2005. So for the sort of 10 years I was in, I was looking to say, how do I improve the knowledge of incident reporting and storytelling? Took a part-time self-funded PhD at Cranfield, which then stopped after about 6 years because I wasn't getting anywhere. And it was costing me money. I wasn't getting the sort of feedback from the industry. But I was generate because I was also teaching. I was getting feedback from my students to say, you know what, this is worthwhile. So since January 16, which is when I set up the Human Diver, probably trained about 500 people face-to-face. No, it's probably 2,500, 3,000 people have taken online training with me. I've written a book, put the documentary If Only together. And so it's a huge educational piece that I'm looking to bring out there.
Okay. I'm not sure if we've had a guest that sort of packed as much stuff into such a short amount of time explaining their background. So fantastic. But obviously a lot of stuff that we can dive into. Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah, well, that gets said a lot.
Yeah. But look, let's start with, I guess, definitions really. And when you talk about human factors, what do you mean by human factors? What are human factors and how does that relate to diving?
So human factors is a science, and it looks at most simply how people interact with other people, with the environment, with the technology, and with systems that are around them. And those systems could be social systems, they could be paperwork, they could be processes. So the science is all about, to summarize it, make it easy to do the right thing or easier to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing. It's primarily a design science, but design is continuous. It's not going on. So the area of human factors that I focus on is predominantly non-technical skills, a little bit of organizational design. Some people might know non-technical skills as crew resource management, as a way of creating a shared mental model within a team so that we get the best outcomes we can within the environment we're in. And so people think human factors is often the factors of the human, but there are different ways of looking at that. And there's a great 4-part blog by Steve Shorrock who you can look into that and look at the different factors of human factors.
Okay, we can put some of that in the show notes, for sure. So in a diving context, I guess when you're talking about like non-technical factors, forget the language you just used, non-technical factors, skills. It's not non-technical skills. You're not talking about how to make sure that your regulator's working properly or the sort of technical things. It's all the stuff around, all the contextual stuff. Is that a fair way of describing it?
Yeah. So it is. It is. People might know non-technical skills, soft skills. So it's about how do you build a high-performance team, and how do they make the best decisions they can. bearing in mind that we collect information from the scenery around us. While we're underwater, we might be able to pick up the current. Visibility reduces our ability to sense what's going on. We're also underwater, so there's a limitation to our sensory perception process. We talk about communication. How do we build a mental model within a team? And that's about sharing information. Then we'll talk about teamwork, leadership, and followership. Every diver who's gone through a training program has been part of a learning team, and the instructors are leaders and the students are followers. But the programs that are out there, the diver training programs, don't really cover this. It's often about compliance and the expectation that you get taught some technical skills, how to use your fins, so propulsion through the water, or your buoyancy, or how to use your regulator or your buoyancy compensation device, or a rebreather, technical piece of equipment. And so where I sort of bring this to life is that I've taken and modified a paper that I co-wrote from the surgical space, where we talk about outcomes being a function of technical skills, context, bit of luck, bit of randomness, and non-technical skills. And it's this relationship between non-technical, technical, context, and luck, randomness that gives us successful outcomes.
Could you give us maybe an example of how this might apply in a diving context, or any context really, just an example of what that means, taking human factors into account, for instance?
Yeah, sure. So the documentary that I put together, called If Only, tells a story of a diving fatality that happened a number of years ago. And it tells a story through different lenses. So it tells the story through the eyes of the widow and of the dive team that were there. And so they've all got their own perspective about what happened and how it made sense. And we dig into how the diver in question, they arrived at the dive site. There was a lot of backstory prior to the day it happened. But on the day they got there, it was a warm day. So there was some thermal stress involved. There were time pressures to get in the water, and that changes our decision making. The team dynamics was very much about individuals rather than teams. The instructor wasn't bringing the team together. And in hindsight, when we look at this, the team they related issues that they couldn't raise at the time. So we talk about psychological safety, the inability to raise a question. And so when the diver jumped off the back of the boat, their oxygen cylinder was turned off, and the electronics on their dive equipment had shut themselves down intentionally to conserve battery power. But the problem was that the checklist that the diver would normally use wasn't done properly. They jumped in the water, and then they were working hard to swim, and then they went hypoxic and drowned. And it would be quite easy just to say they made a simple human error because they didn't do their checklist properly. But the story that I told comes from different perspectives. And now, by the time you get to the end of the documentary, you go, so that's how it made sense for them to do what they did. So I work, I'm going to say, proactively, prospectively, trying to educate people to look at their own fallibility, the fact that we're always trading off what is considered right. This work is imagined, the right thing to do, versus the reality, the work is done. So it's trying to do stuff to prepare people, but it's also looking at investigations to look backwards to say, how does it make sense? And it's really easy to join the dots and go, they should have done that, would have done that, they could have done that. These counterfactuals don't help the learning story because they tell a story that didn't exist. What we have to do is dig into something called local rationality of the individuals involved to say, how does it make sense? So it's a powerful story that looks at many different angles concerning human factors.
I love what you said there. I've heard you say it before. How did it make sense for them to do what they did? And it's a very useful perspective because it's one that we probably don't use very often. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Like, I suppose a number of like in a diving context, I'm imagining, but I'm kind of speculating, but there's a lot of work that goes into one of these things, right? I imagine I suppose it depends on how big the challenge is and how much planning, how much money, and you've got all these sort of, maybe there's a sunk cost fallacy that, we've spent all this time doing this, planning this, and here's the moment, we don't want to let it go. We've got to, go back and do it all over again. It would be too, whatever. There's probably a range of things like that gets in the way. I mean, how do you work out, how do you kind of reconstruct how it made sense for them to do what they did? And then going forward, planning something, anything, how do you apply some of those tools? If you could walk us through that, I think that'd be fascinating.
Yeah, sure. So brilliant. So the first step is try not to work backwards from the event, because when you have got the outcome, you know what the outcome is, and you can work backwards joining the dots. So as a simple example, if I work backwards in a simple tree, adverse event accidents don't happen in a linear fashion. They happen when things converge. But if I start looking forward and I have a decision, and I'm going to do this visually, but I'm going to talk through as well. So I've got a single decision and I've got 4 options that move forward. And each one of those has got 4 options. And then I've got 4 options on top of that. So within 3 layers, I've got 64 different potential outcomes at the top. So, this is all about risk. Probabilities, I've got 1 in 64 chance. If they're all equal, I've got 1 in 64. Now, I don't know many people who can sit there and work out 3 steps ahead and say, what's the likelihood of each one of those? So we make the best guess we can with the resources we've got, the knowledge we've got, the skills we've got, and we say, I think that's the best choice. I think that's the best choice based on our goals and drivers and where we're going. And we end up with many good outcomes and some bad outcomes. Now, when we work backwards, we start at the top of the tree and we go, oh, that led to that, that led to that, that led to that. Oh, look, there's the bum decision that somebody made. And it's really easy to identify that. So what I try to do is actually say, what's the context surrounding the decision-making process? So it could be, as you said, sunk costs. We get to a dive site and there's time pressure that's there. The equipment breaks. It's okay. I've dived with this in the past. So there's some previous mental models, some experience that said, it worked okay the last time. Therefore, it will work this time going forward. That's just a normal mental decision-making process. We've got peer pressure. I don't want to be the one that thumbs this dive now before we even get anywhere, because I might be diving with a buddy, and if I don't dive, they can't dive. So it's not just individual sunk cost, it's potentially team sunk cost that's going on as well. What are we rewarding people? This might be the perfect rec to go and dive. The visibility is unusually good, which means we can go and shoot some video or shoot some stills of it. We sit there and go, if I don't get in, we've lost that opportunity. So there's a whole bunch of biases that are there. So the idea for any sort of investigation is actually to start at the start. And, I got asked the question this weekend where I was delivering some training, how far back do you go? And that really is a case of how much do you want to learn? Do you want to learn about your own performance, your own behavior? Then actually just focus on individuals. And you might want to go back. It might go back a week. It might go back 2 weeks. You might go back to look at your training. But if you want to learn about the organization and the team in general, you might go further back than that. And you start looking at how the training was delivered, how the instructors were trained, what's the quality control like within the training program. So looking at each one of those, what I'm talking about, error-producing conditions or performance-shaping factors, what's there to make it more likely you do the wrong decision, knowing that actually we don't know the outcomes. So the whole sort of purpose of the training that I deliver is it's not about safety. It's about performance, and safety comes as a byproduct of performance that's out there. And so you do the activity, you plan it, you brief it, you do it, and then you debrief it. And that's one of the things that I think most people take away from the training I deliver is the value of the debrief and the reflection. Most debriefs are around when things go wrong. But if things haven't gone wrong, what's the value of the debrief? There is always an opportunity to look at what went well and why, what went, what do we need to improve on and how are we going to do it? Even the language we use, what went wrong? Well, nothing went wrong. Okay, what can we improve on then? And so there's this subtle difference there is there's always something to improve on.
Yeah. And I guess you could think about, well, what could have gone wrong?
Mm. So that's a great question. There's a blog that I wrote about 2 or 3 weeks ago, which was, were you lucky or were you good?
Mm,
And people go, oh yeah, we were good. Okay, tell me what you did that
mm,
you can now replicate and do it on another situation. How
mm,
close were you to the failure point? Your risk margin that you build into
mm,
everything you do in diving, in business, in the corporate space, in high risk industries, there is a margin of risk tolerance that you're willing to accept, but you don't know what that is precisely. So if you look back, and even if you've had a successful outcome, how close were you to the failure line?
mm.
And that's a huge shift. And you can start that by going, were we lucky or were we good? Oh, we were good. Right,
How do
let's dig
you,
into that.
how do you assess that? Because that's a really powerful concept, but it's hard to, how do you look at that?
So actually, in terms of assessing on an individual basis, you can't. Well, I'm going to say you can generically say, or generally
Mm,
say, you can ask the question, were we lucky or were we good?
mm,
But there's no metric that says it was good or how good
mm,
it was. It's about triggering the reflection process to ask those questions. And once you've asked them, and if you're operating in a psychologically safe environment, then you can dig into those
mm-hmm.
understandings, the near misses that are there.
Right.
Because near misses cognitively are often treated as successes, not
Mm,
failures. And
mm,
that's not just at the individual operational level, somebody doing a task. It's also at an organizational level. So if a project manager is managing risk, or a program manager is managing risk, and they come up with the outcomes, and it's like, yeah, we hit that. And that, they're just inside budget. Does anybody
mm,
go, see, how do we manage to do that?
yeah.
you know, and if you are well inside your risk budget, which is, the purpose of the risk budget is that it costs you money. If you're well inside that in terms of money or schedule,
Mm,
what did we cut the corners to achieve
yeah.
that?
To achieve that.
And organizations reward when the margins may be really close.
Yeah. That's so important. And I think a lot of organizations don't take a significantly longer term view of this because I imagine it's the same in the diving context. Is if you get lucky rather than good, that's going to give you a false sense of confidence the next time. Eventually things won't go well. And you could also maybe trace it back to, well, oh yeah, we got lucky. And so we made the same decision the next time around.
Absolutely. And that's, our decision-making process is really quite simple. We rely on these heuristics and biases, these mental shortcuts to go, it worked the last time, therefore it's okay. Because often we don't have enough time or money to sit down and reflect on what's happened. When something bad happens, the spotlight's drawn on it. So we have an adverse event in diving, we have an adverse event in business. We don't look back at the margins that were there because we just don't have the mindset of reflection. And I think that's where high performance teams within the military, predominantly aviation, but I would say the special ops community as well, they spend a lot of time reflecting and not resting on their laurels to say that was a good outcome, therefore it was a good task. Where actually we look back and say, how do we get there?
Could we spend a little bit of time about how you apply some of this thinking going forward making decision, planning a dive or something? How would you put some of this into practice into the future?
Yeah. So the process of planning a dive, understand what you're going to do. Could be exploring a wreck. It could be exploring a cave system. It could be about just visiting a reef and trying to find some sea life, sea creatures to take photos of or survey. So the first bit is try to determine what the goal is. And is everybody aligned with that? So, and that can be a real challenge in the diving space because often we jump onto a boat and people have got different perspectives. And in the majority of cases, it doesn't matter because the risk and the risk is quite low and the margins are quite big. So you've got a fair amount of maneuver to speak with. So once you've decided and clarified the roles and the goals, the goals, then determine who's going to do it. Who's going to do what. And it could be if you're surveying a wreck, who's going to run the line, who's going to hold the camera, who's going to hold the lights so that we do stuff. So make sure that there is role clarity within the team. then what we'll do is we'll start to identify risks to what's going on. Do we have the resources that need to be in place to achieve that? Do we have the right gases? Have they been analyzed to make sure that they're not toxic, or we end up breathing a hypoxic mix and pass out? So, we've got to the plan, we've made sure stuff's there. Then we'll do something I call test the plan. And that the purpose there is to pick holes in it. We have something called the confirmation bias. We find things that we're looking for, and that reinforces, yep, we're doing the right thing. Whereas actually what we would like to be able to do is assign dissent and have constructive dissent. So actually picking somebody in the team to say, where's the holes? I want you to find all the holes in the plan as to why this isn't going to work. And it could be, when was the last time somebody dived this wreck? Is it what we expect it to be? What's the visibility like? What's our plan B? If we can't go and shoot the bow and the chains that are there and set the lighting up, what's our plan B? So looking at contingencies that we're trying to do. So that's the operational contingencies. Then we'll talk about emergencies. What happens if somebody runs out of gas? What happens if we have a separation? What's the protocol that we're going to follow? So make sure that when we get in the water, there is a clarity about what's happening. And then the final piece is letting people know that there's going to be a debrief. So we're planning this, we're briefing it, and then we know that actually we're going to debrief it. So when we come back after this, the debrief is going to take place at such and such time. And so the framework, and I've got a framework for that, we'll use that. So people are aware that we're going to learn. So we'll go off and do the dive. And no plan survives first contact with the enemy anyway, because you don't know what the visibility is going to be like. You don't know what the current's going to be like. Things may have changed. So that's where you refer back to your sort of contingencies, your operational contingency plans. Are we going to shoot a different part, or, we can't get into the wreck because it's collapsed. So we then finish the dive, and then we follow a debrief framework that I put together, which looks at basically learning. Did we achieve the goals? And how long's the debrief going to take? Is it going to be a 10-minute debrief, or is it going to be a couple of hours? And that really just depends on the complexity of the task. Then the leader creates a learning environment, psychologically safe environment, by talking about a mistake they've made on that dive. And that basically means that it's easier to talk about it if the leader has talked about their mistake. And I saw some research at the weekend that backs up this premise that leaders making themselves vulnerable allows other people to share their stories as well. Then we'll talk about the planning. Was the plan effective? Was the brief effective? Did we have everything we needed to do? Was the current, what was the slack time when the tide goes slack? Was that what we were expecting? Was the shot on the wreck where we were expecting it to be? And then the real learning happens, which is a series of questions of what did I do well and why? What do I need to improve on, and how am I going to do it? What did the team do well and why? What did the team need to improve, and how they're going to fix it? And of those, the why did it go well and how do we improve it are the most important questions, because observations are relatively easy to recount. What we're trying to understand is why did that go well? And we dig into specifics. Oh yeah, team communication was good. What was good about it? Well, where you shone your light in front of me and you kept it there on the wreck, I could see you were present through passive communication. That's a perfect placement. So that's a subset of communications, but it means it's repeatable. And then if we talk about how do we improve it, well, actually, when we were ascending and the decompression and we'd used some hand signals, they weren't clear. There was confusion about what we were going to do and how long we were going to stay at that stop. What we need to do is ensure that there is a closed loop communication. So if I signal we're going up, we're going to do decompression 2 minutes, and you come back with 2 minutes, I know you've understood that. As opposed to just saying, did you understand that? Yes, okay. Well, okay, okay is a terrible confirmation process because you say, are you just saying okay? As you go, okay. Or did you actually comprehend what we were going to do? And then the final part of the debrief after everybody's done their learnings is, what are we going to change? So do we need to modify some equipment? Do we need to modify some process? Do we need to raise an incident report to say, actually, there's some learning that other people can follow through? So that hopefully would give a sort of simple framework. Now, those frameworks were based on two acronyms that I've written, but I didn't use them and say, right, what we have, so the other thing is practicing these things. You know what the letter is. You don't have to say you is, is understand the goals. N is notify role. Yeah. So by having them as a little mental aid, then we can just have a conversation. They go, oh, that works, as opposed to, right, what we're going to do now is this.
So there's so much really good stuff there that it transfers to other fields. One observation that I had as you're describing all of that is just around just the act of planning, I think, is the value. It's not to produce a piece of paper that says this is the plan. And then, how are you going to look at, I don't know, page 25 of your plan underwater or whatever, whatever it is, right? It's not, it's the act of planning that helps everyone get on the same page, isn't it?
Totally. So I think it's Eisenhower's quote of planning is essential, but plans are useless. And the purpose of the planning process is to talk through the contingencies and make sure that they're in people's heads, because the sort of research shows that people, when they're in sort of tight timelines, what they want are cognitive prompts. They don't want to go, oh, what was the contingency plan? All right, we'll flick through that stuff. It's these memory aids that say this is how we do things, and creating that shared mental model. So the planning process, making sure people are in place, they understand the risks, and they're pulling it apart. And some training that I've done with an organization called Red Team Thinking, they've taken this concept of red teaming and structured it, and they've got a number of tools. And the purpose is really, it's about assigning constructive dissent within an organization. So many organizations are afraid of talking about the failures, especially if their bosses come up with this plan. Hey, this is what we're going to do. Yeah. And they sit there and go, that ain't going to work. Yeah. But they say, how's everybody? Oh, yeah, greens, we're happy. Everything's going to work. And it's really easy to dismiss that. So I don't know if any of your previous speakers have talked about pre-mortems from Gary Klein, and that need to create an ability to look backwards, knowing the failure has happened, which is a different cognitive thought process to working forwards in the timeline.
Yeah, going back and looking at what went wrong sometimes is a problem, certainly in an organizational context, because then people get quite defensive and it's hard to get all the facts out on the table. And the pre-mortem is a very useful technique to get around some of that.
Yes. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Could we talk a little bit about some of the specific things that could go wrong in a dive? And just you mentioned team and team dynamics, and I'm wondering if we could just kind of look at that a little bit, and what goes into good team dynamics versus team dynamics that just aren't very good.
Well, yeah, and I think the bit about team dynamics, or just even interpersonal relationships and dynamics that go on, because often teams it takes time and effort to form a team, and the leader needs to take a critical role in that. And in the majority of the sports diving space, and I would say probably in the corporate space as well, people don't know what teams are about. They don't know what leadership is about. Often it's about management and telling people that this is how things are done. So if there isn't a clear goal about what we're trying to do, then it's quite hard to call people out. So, as a team, it's making sure that everybody knows each other and they know what the goals are, that they understand their roles and their skills and how they contribute towards that. So in the diving space, the most prevalent place where teams occur, but they don't realize it, is in the instructional setting. So diving instructors will often have a framework which they've got to follow through. There'll be a slate that says these are the skills that have to be taught, but nobody's actually taught them how to communicate effectively with their students in front of them. So the first bit then is create psychologically safe environment, build a relationship, make sure the team are included. They feel part of it. Right, actually, we're going to go and do this training scenario, and we're going to cover these skills. There will be some mistakes. This is a learning environment, so expect some mistakes to happen. You're not going to get it perfect, because if you do it perfect, what are you doing on this program? And I'm going to make some mistakes, so I want you to pick those up. So what we're doing, the first couple of bits of psychological safety, the framework of inclusion and learner safety, then I'm asking people to contribute and just say, look, if I get something wrong, speak up, challenge, because I may be tired, I might have an issue. And so what we're trying to do is lower this thing called an authority gradient. And that's one of the things that came out of aviation investigations was this recognition that captains were sitting up on this pedestal and the co-pilots, the first officers, were unable to challenge. And that's the same in the operating theatre environment. You've got surgeons and you've got nurses. In the diving space, you've got instructors and students. And it's not a bad thing to lower that gradient. The subordinate person has only got a certain amount of space that they can step up. Whereas actually, if you can lower the gap between the leader and the follower, then it's easier. So the other bit then is looking for non-verbal communications and the feedback that happens. So when you communicate, what you want to do is check some understanding. And the easiest way to do that is through open questions. So tell me, explain to me, describe to me what you're going to do, as opposed to, did you understand that? Yeah. And it's easy to say yes for a couple of reasons. One is I don't want to look stupid. Often there's time constraints. So if I say, no, I don't, the rest of the team go, oh, God.
Right.
Now we've got to waste time waiting for you to do that. So it's much easier to say, yes, I understand, because we think that we'll be able to capture it as we go along. Whereas actually, if you turn around to the student and say, tell me what you're going to do on this dive, describe to me when we get down to the wreck or we get down to the bottom of the thing, what you're expecting to see and what the first steps are. And it's really difficult to answer an open question with a closed answer because you look quite stupid if you do that. So it's easier to conform. So you can nudge people in the right sort of way. And looking at their verbal response and their non-verbal response. Many people can lie verbally, but it's really difficult to lie non-verbally. And if there's a mismatch between verbal and non-verbal, then actually we can pick that up subconsciously. And that's the breach of trust. You look at that person and go, what they're saying is not how they're behaving. So you can start to explore that sort of avenue as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff there as well. And I love that open versus closed questioning, because we've all been in that situation where, the teacher sort of says, did you understand this? Here's I don't know, you're in high school calculus class and there's a formula that's on half of the chalkboard, back when we had chalkboards. Did you understand this? And you're like, yes, or I understood, half of the words that, what does yes mean, right? I understood half of the, half the stuff on the chalkboard, or half of what you said. I understood all the words, but I don't know, it's, that's a very good technique.
Yeah. I mean, even,
very simple.
Taking it up in the corporate space is, a project meeting. Right. We've just talked about stuff. Is everybody clear what we're going to do? Yes. And they all walk out, and then you watch this huddle create just outside the project meeting door where everybody goes, what are we doing? What's the schedule? That's not what I was expecting to. So it's, and people think, but it takes time that I don't have to ask an open question. But I tell you what, it's a lot more quick. It's a lot quicker, and it costs you less to ask the open question in the meeting than it is to try and fix the problem afterwards when the assumptions haven't been validated.
Right. And I guess is all of that a component in what you call psychological safety? Is that, I presume that also means the freedom to speak up when something doesn't feel right, that all of that stuff.
Yes. So it's this, the sort of technical definition of psychological safety is this interpersonal risk, or this belief that it's safe to take an interpersonal risk. So it's a one-to-many and a many-to-one. So trust is one-to-one, whereas psychological safety is this shared belief within the team. And it's not about being nice. Often psychological safety is, we've got to accept people and we've got to be nice to them. Actually, psychological safety can be really uncomfortable, because actually what I want you to do is challenge me. I want you to speak up, and organizations talk about, we want to speak up culture. That is, yes, we have to give people the voices, but it's this bit that we want them to tell us when things are wrong and they're not right. And we question and challenge. And here, I've got an idea here about this dive. The last time I went here, the current picked up. That means we're not going to get into the wreck on this side. we have to go there. That's great. As opposed to, you might have somebody who's very closed-minded. So, yeah, I've been here before. Don't worry about it. We can do it. And you sit there going, oh, okay. And so what happens is, as soon as you shut somebody down, they withhold future conversations too. Because you sit there and go, you know what? I don't care. Yeah. And we end up with a sort of, the malicious side of us comes out and you go, you know what? Let's see what happens. Let's see you land flat on your face.
Right.
Now you're in the wrong. So I'm going to prove you by proxy that I was right.
Yeah. Yes. So much good stuff there. And the other term that you use is just culture. What do you mean by that?
So just culture started around sort of 1990s, where it was this swing from, we blamed, and then we went, no, we can't blame because the learning stops. So we then moved to a no blame culture, which then basically people get away with stuff. You know, where you are, the performance management is not being done properly. And so people are making poor decisions when they should know better. So this just culture was brought into basically a midway ground. So in the sort of technical sense, what we're talking about is it's this recognition that we all make mistakes, and we need to take into account our experience, our training, our context in which we're operating. But at some point, the unacceptable, negligent, sabotaging behaviors are punished. So there's a bit where we say, look, the majority of us are doing the right thing. We're trying to do the right thing. But there are some bad apples that are out there that need to be punished. And it's not so much where the line is drawn, it's who draws it. So it could be lawyers, it could be the HR department, it could be your peer group. And so what we're trying to understand is that, and the purpose of a just culture is to facilitate incident reporting and storytelling, because we can never learn all the mistakes ourselves. And aviation has embraced this because they protect safety stories that get submitted to incident reports that allow others to dig into the reports. And they don't just stop at, they didn't follow the rule. They sit there and go, is the rule followable? What was the context in which they were in that made it difficult to follow the rule? Was the equipment designed poorly so that when they made a selection, then actually they got the wrong outcome? They were doing the right, in their mind, they thought they were doing the right thing, but actually it's the wrong thing. So a just culture requires an adverse event or an accident, and something gone wrong that then allows us to look back and say, how did it make sense? And a psychologically safe environment, in my perspective, and I don't think there's any sort of research that's looked at this in sort of defining it, is you create the environment where people will speak up and challenge and question and say, you know what, these maintenance records are out of date. Oh, don't worry about it. It'll be okay. Just cross-sign them and off you go. And it's like, no, this isn't the right thing to do. And so the psychological safety is the prospective, proactive piece, and a just culture is the reactive piece that looks back. You still need a psychologically safe environment and a just culture to have the difficult conversations, but that's my sort of split. So one is prospective, proactive, and the other one is reactive.
You mentioned, and I think for both of those things, the being too nice part, I think, is a challenge. There's this sort of this one of the cognitive biases that exists is this sort of false consensus effect, that you're trying to conform with the group, and if I raise my hand, then maybe that's going to make people uncomfortable. But we have to be able to do that.
Yes, absolutely. And so,
how do you get that happening in, let's say, you must have had this, right? In a group of people that you're working with, everyone's just kind of a little too nice, or there's sort of, I don't want to be someone's raising their hand and so I don't want to be the negative person, right?
Yeah, I don't want to be that person.
Yeah.
And so what you do is you congratulate their dissent. And it's that bit of, hey, Ben, looks like you got an idea. Pick holes in it. I don't know everything. And in fact, we as the team have got a shared understanding. We're a team of experts in what you do. Each individual person has got some expertise, and none of us is bright as all of us together. So if we were in that meeting, I would also look not just for the hand that says, I don't want to be that person. I'd also look for the body language, the non-verbal communications. And it might be a little frown, or it might be just a little body movement. And you sit there and go, Ben, it looks like you've got something to say. I don't know everything. Look, pick holes in it. And that's the vulnerability piece that, and so that's what, to a certain extent, the red team thinking guys are about, is putting that in a structured manner as tools that you can deploy as part of a meeting where actually you force people to provide constructive dissent to the plan. But it can also work at the individual team level and the social level. But it requires the leader to turn around and say, I don't know everything. You've probably got a better idea of what the specific task is than I do.
Yeah, that's great. The red team thinking, is that Bryce Hoffman's? Is that his?
Yeah, Bryce and Marcus. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I'm trying to get Bryce on the podcast as well. So it's useful that these two things have come together. But I think that makes a lot of sense. Very powerful. It doesn't happen as often as one would like to see. And I want to link this also to something else that I've heard you talk about, I'm sure happens in diving all the time, is when to turn back, when to quit, I guess, for lack of a better word, or when to, we're not going to do this. Like, how do you make that decision?
Yeah, it's a really difficult thing to consider. So there is in the technical diving world, in the cave diving world, this phrase that anybody can thumb a dive at any time for any reason. And that, turn back. And so thumb a dive is because when you put your thumb up, that means we're going out, we're leaving. And that could be, that means we're going all the way out, or it means that with a finger is we're going in that direction if we're actually inside a cave or inside a wreck. Now, the difficulty here is, and you already touched on sunk costs. The more that we get engaged to it, the harder it is to turn around. So one of the easy ways to help the team make those decisions is come up with some standards. So in the open ocean diving and the cave diving, you will have something called a minimum gas. And that minimum gas is a limit inside your cylinders, and it's the lowest amongst the team, where you turn around and say, if I reach 80 bar in my pressure gauge, that is the end dive. It's a non-negotiable. And that gives me enough gas to take me and my buddy while we do a gas sharing ascent. So he's using my gas and we're both breathing from the cylinders on my back. We can ascend either to the surface or to the next level of our ascent, where we change to a decompression gas to accelerate our process. It could also be in a cave, you say, right, we're going to go X distance in, but it's about having clarity of standards before you enter the water. And that's where the brief comes in. And there's also the mutual accountability that if somebody breaches those standards, you call them out. It's like that minimum gas was 100 bar. You turned at 90, compromised the team safety at that level. Yeah, but there was that thing to do. It does not matter. And so having that clarity of what's an acceptable piece. If you don't say what that standard is, you have something called creeping determinism, normalization of deviance, normalization of risk, where you sit there and go, we'll just go a little bit more, go a little bit more. And that whole thing about Challenger and the O-rings, and the same with Columbia, was this inability to learn that drift happens within a team, it happens within an organization. It is normal human behavior because the rewards that are out there are perceived to be greater than the threat that you're facing. And if you've never had a bad outcome, you don't have the recency or the recall bias that says this will happen. Because you sit there and go, it happens to somebody else because they weren't careful, they didn't pay attention. But I'm better than that, and I wouldn't make the same mistake. But if you've got non-negotiable standards, and actually makes it easier to call the dive.
Yeah, it reminds me of that Hemingway quote of how did you go bankrupt? It was very slowly, and then all of a sudden, or something along those lines. It's about exponential, where basically it's describing an exponential shift, right? And if you get that creep of that, I can't remember exactly the word that you used, but I love it. It's just that sort of, you're kind of sliding almost imperceptibly into a problem, a big problem.
Totally. And I had one of my quotes from a student yesterday, which was brilliant. He said, problems are not born large. They're
Mm,
born small and they grow. And that's
mm,
the issue, is that as humans, we don't deal in absolutes very well. We deal in relatives. And
mm,
so the relative risk between one and the next is quite small. And then the next, and then the next. And we have these small deltas, these small deviations between what's acceptable. And then when it goes bang, everyone looks back and you've got the whole collection of aggregated risk. We sit
mm,
there going, how did we miss that huge aggregation of risk that's there? It's like you didn't,
mm,
because you weren't looking from that. And so if you've got lines in the sand that are drawn, it makes it easier. And you're saying, what was our original standard? What were we accepting? And, from the shuttle Challenger loss, they moved it from an experimental platform to it's all okay. Taking a teacher up on Challenger, hang on, this is an experimental spacecraft. What are we doing putting a teacher on there? Oh, look, everything's fine. It's all worked okay. And so
mm,
mentally, you shift the whole environment to say it's acceptable. We'll move on.
mm. Right. And then you get into that I was lucky rather than good space.
Yes.
Um,
And that requires the question to
yeah.
take place and reflect back.
Yeah. Okay. I want to talk about something that may not seem all that exciting, but actually is very interesting to me is that's checklists. Okay.
Yeah,
And,
sure.
and the reason I find it really really interesting, I don't know about exciting, maybe that's a little bit over the top, but is that what we're talking about when I think about checklists, and there's a book called The Checklist Manifesto that you may have come across.
Andy, yeah.
Yes. And it's when you're in a situation that's high stress or, when you're in it, basically, this idea of being sort of in a situation, you're not going to be thinking clearly. And so by having, or there's a chance that you're not thinking clearly. So by having certain very simple rules or things to do, it eliminates someone in a very calm state has thought this out and has kind of pulled something together. This is how this how or why pilots use them in cockpits and things like that. But when you're in a high stakes situation, that's when you need some of this stuff, and you don't want people to be thinking creatively on the spot, right? When they're dealing with an actual situation. And I've heard you talk about it. And I've also heard you talk about the distinction between sort of these kinds of checklists and other kinds of checklists. So they're sort of there to, cover your legal backside.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could share your thoughts on this, what goes into.
Yeah. So the bit about checklist is, as you said, it's spot on. It's about trying to reduce the likelihood of the errors that are taking place in a high stress environment. But a checklist is just a tool that exists in a social space. And so the book, The Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande, was all about how did they bring the surgical safety checklist into the World Health Organization. And they went through a number of iterations using human factors principles, making sure that they understood the tasks, the critical steps that they couldn't afford not to complete. And so they built 3 parts of the checks that make it sure that the patient is prepared for surgery. So you will do the arrival, the sign in, then they'll do the stop, and then you'll do the sign out and make sure that the patient doesn't have anything inside them that they shouldn't. They've been given the drugs and things. So they went through that many iterations and said, right, this is what we're going to do. And then they deployed it. And so the reason why it was so successful was because they'd empowered the scrub nurse to manage the checklist. So they'd empowered them to say, if the checklist isn't finished, then we don't continue the operation. So we create a social setup that uses that. Now, there were a number of big arguments with surgeons and nurses going, I know what I'm doing, blah, 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 because socially, culturally, surgeons are put on a pedestal of excellence. Why do I need to do a checklist? I know what I'm doing. It's like, yes, but when your brain is full, because you're really busy doing other stuff, you miss steps. Mm-hmm. So culturally, we're basically bringing from aviation this recognition that we all make mistakes. We're all fallible. And we know that that's going to be the case. So there's an intention to slow us down. And Daniel Kahneman is Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about system one and system two. System one is this fast processing, heuristics, cognitive biases that allow us to process really information really quickly to get stuff done. We make assumptions all the time. And system two is this slow, logical thought process. And they're just concepts about how we operate. The purpose of a checklist is to move us from system one to system two so that we invoke the logical process. Now, with any measured tool or any tool that's used and then can be measured, it can also be weaponized. So the easy bit for organizations is you just turn around and say, right, here's a checklist, fill it in because I want to measure your compliance. And you can get really perverse situations. So I've heard of one of the trusts in the National Health Service trust in the UK, where they were measuring checklist, that surgical safety checklist compliance. So they get to the end of the day, end of the week, and they'd measure the boxes that were ticked. And if the organizations, the teams weren't following the checklist, i.e. they hadn't ticked them, they would start to get punished. So guess what? People just tick the boxes
without doing the thing.
Without doing the thing. So that's, as a liability limitation exercise, the organization is, hey, look, our teams are doing the checklist because that's what the standard says. But actually, are they doing what's written? And that's the important piece. And the doing the checklist is the recognition that systems will drive our behaviors, and the management and the leadership need to recognize that if you time compress things, that's the easiest way to introduce stress. If you time compress things, people will get stuff done without running the checklist. And if you reward good outcomes without understanding whether or not you're good or lucky, then you just reinforce the point that the checklist doesn't add any value. So as with all of these things, it's a complex system that's not just about a case of, here, Ben, here's a checklist, use it. You sit there going, who designed this? That's not how I do my job. And a checklist is a compromise.
The weaponization of checklists. I love that phrase. I'm going to use it probably in the future because you describe exactly what that thing is. And also if you have, 150 things in a checklist, that's not the point.
It's not a good checklist. No. I mean, my sort of view of that is you're probably talking about 5 to 8 items, and the words on there are no more, and again, 5 to 8 words, because you can look at a block of 5 to 8 words and you don't need to read every word to comprehend what's on there. A checklist is there as a prompt for comprehensive training that's already been delivered. It's not there as basically a backup for poor training.
Yeah, great. Love that. I'm conscious of time, but I did want to touch on one thing, and that is around driving change in your field. Because I've heard you describe that in the past I think it was something around incident reporting in the diving space. I can't remember exactly what the thing was. And he said, I burned some bridges advocating for some of these changes. And I think there's a lot of parallels in a lot of other fields. And in my field and what I've worked in corporate risk management, I think there are a lot of things that are fundamentally just broken and need to be completely simplified, redesigned, all of this good stuff. But I can also see people being very wedded to old ways of doing things. And so I'm just wondering if you could share any of your experiences or your insights from those experiences about how to get people to change or let go of things that aren't serving us.
So the first thing I would say is looking at change top down and bottom up. So top down, to create change requires a phrase from one of my tutors at Lund, which was, you need a politically relevant event. So if there isn't something that creates fear, that creates a goal at the organizational leadership level, change is unlikely to happen. And that could be a major accident. It could be a regulatory change. It could be public perception. It could be financial drivers. But there has to be something at the top that says change is needed. And in the safety industries, you look at aviation, it's where they brought crew resource management, non-technical skills in. Tenerife, Kegworth, United Airlines 173. There's a whole bunch of high-profile aviation accidents, which they then looked at the cockpit voice recorders and went, these weren't stupid pilots. They were locally rational. It made sense for them to do what they were doing. In the oil and gas industry, trying to bring human factors in, Piper Alpha was a lot of process safety stuff, and Deepwater Horizon, again, trying to bring human factors and process safety in. In nuclear industry, 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, these are big events that have created change. If you don't have one of those, it's very difficult to get buy-in from the leadership to create change. So what you do is the other end, which is what I tried to do, because I couldn't get change done in the diving industry because I get misquoted on this. There are not enough dead people to make a difference. And the misquote is, Gareth says we need to kill more people to create change. And it's like, no, that is not what I was saying. It's just, you know, emotionally, there's just not enough significance to make a difference. So the other end is you start bottom up and you create change that way. And one of the books that I read a number of years ago was from a lady called Tina Rosenberg called Join the Club. And it was about creating social change bottom up. So what I'm doing now is working with, I'm going to say, influencers. I started to do that and it didn't really work.
Right.
I'm working with interested individuals who want to learn and improve, and they share their experience. And the difficulty with something like human factors and non-technical skills is it's marketed as a safety thing. And that's one of my learning bits is safety doesn't sell. Safety only sells when it comes to a compliance activity or as an emotional argument that's associated with it. So I'm now looking at this marketing in a performance framework.
Yeah.
So it's about achieving more on your dive, having a better social experience, staying in the sport, getting more done with what you're able to do on a dive. And so creating a group of like-minded individuals. And so there's a lot of Kotter's 8 stages. If people haven't come across that, that's, the cycle of change. And I'm now getting to the point where I've got a critical mass, but I've got people who are now more interested at the agency level. And now there's this bit of, if they have it, we want it. So now you've got a little bit of competition that one agency is offering something that others aren't, and that could be a discriminator. But it's not safety. Safety doesn't sell. And the number of incidents is way less than that gets reported. And that was where my sort of real focus was to start with, improve incident reporting. And so what I'm trying to do is take almost a systems view of how to create a change. People don't report incidents because there isn't a reporting system that's available. They know about it. They don't know what to share because the stories, nobody tells them how to tell a learning story. Social media is a great way of getting it out there, but it's a really adversarial ground. And people post their near misses, their mess up, their screw ups, and people throw metaphorical rocks at them for being stupid. So you've got to explain to people, why do errors occur? What is human error? And the variability of people. So there's a multifaceted approach to try and create change. It's not just a case of, here we go, deploy checklists because that's going to save things. Well, no, you've got to create the environment that says, why do I use checklists? You need to take a systems view.
Yeah, that's great. And I see so many parallels. You talk about safety doesn't sell, risk also doesn't sell in the larger organizational context. And it's kind of got into the same sort of place of being very much a compliance led exercise. And it's all about performance. It's all, you do these things and you're going to get more of what you want. And so that's great. I will,
one of the
definitely.
Things I would say for your, So one of the things I would say for your risk discussions, one of the more interesting questions that I gave a presentation to some military folk, senior military folk, talking about risk management in a messy world and the need to operate, differently. And I asked them about the risk matrices that were there. And often risks are looked at individually. So I just said, okay, so how many greens make a red? How many yellows make a red? And there's sort of the big thinks bubble of, because these risks are treated not interdependent
as discrete things. I love that. we love our colors in risk management. It's very kindergarten-esque. We love colors and shapes and sizes, but
actually it's very humans. It's very human things that we want to simplify complex things into, I could do that.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that we often talk about risk in isolation, and that's a problem because always risk to something. What's at risk? And if we're not clear on that, then we're just talking at cross purposes. We're not really having
non-technical skills.
Yeah, exactly. No, I love it. Love your insights there. Look, I'm conscious of time. I think we covered a lot of ground, but was there anything that you wanted to mention that you don't think we got enough time to cover?
No. I love it. You can find me on LinkedIn.
Yes,
really. Lots of postings there, just getting people think different. I don't have the answers. And I think that's one of the big things to take away in any sort of complex space or the risk management uncertainty space is the need to be curious and ask awkward questions that get people thinking differently.
Yeah, I love that. So, the book that you wrote, could you just share the title again?
It's Under Pressure, Diving Deeper with Human Factors.
Right.
And whilst it's a diving book and it's got like 30 diving stories in it, there's a whole bunch of human factors, non-technical skills, risk management stuff in there as well. So if anybody wants to bring theory to life, that's what the book is about.
Fantastic. Love it. And if people want to find you, you mentioned LinkedIn. Are you on other places that?
Yeah, so LinkedIn, and the best site to get me and all of the work that I've written is the www.thehumandiver.com. And there's a contact page there, and there's a blog with about 150 plus blogs on there now. So all about human factors in diving. But if you're able to look at something and abstract it to your own space, there's loads of learning in there for high risk industries, teamwork, all of those bits.
Perfect. I love it. Gareth, thank you so much. Really appreciate this chat. It was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Ben.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that. Check out Gareth's work. Links are in the show notes as usual. If you enjoyed this episode and if you enjoy the show, give it a share. That always helps us out an awful lot. Now, there will soon be a lot happening at All Things Risk. A number of changes are afoot. I want to share these with you and give you an opportunity to be a part of them. So subscribe to the show. Also get on our mailing list so that you don't miss anything. You can do that at allthingsrisk.co.uk. We will be back very soon. Until then, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.